Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is May 21st, 2025, Wednesday, May 21st, 2025. And our first story out of Stranger Than Fiction stories is titled The Phantom of Waltham Pond. It was the winter of 1894, and in Waltham, Massachusetts, many men were unemployed and eager to accept any job. However, if the work was to be performed on the Walker estate, there were no volunteers. One man said, "I would not undertake it again if they would give me the Walker estate." The property in question was one of the finest in Massachusetts, owned by two wealthy maiden sisters. During the previous months, they had employed a large force of men to work on the house and improve the grounds. One of the tasks was to draw off a large pond, and it required the keeping of a gang at it all night. Come morning, the entire crew walked off the job. However, another gang was said to do the same work during the night. Before long, they also quit and refused to return to the estate. A local newspaper sent over a reporter to investigate what was going on. He interviewed the first men, and they said that at midnight they saw the door of the boathouse on the banks of the pond open. A man emerged with a red lantern and rowed out onto the pond. By the lantern's light, they recognized the face of a former owner of the estate, sometime since deceased. Needless to say, they didn't stop to see any more and left right away. The second group of men did not know of the story, however, they described the same thing. The history of the house and the Boston Blue Bloods. In 1789, Christopher Gore built a house on 300 acres. He had another large mansion on fashionable Bowden Square, where he and his wife Rebecca entertained lavishly. The house was badly damaged by fire in 1799. The couple toured Europe for several months and took note of the architecture for country estates, which they incorporated into the new house at Waltham using the design of French and English architects. The new mansion was completed in 1806. Christopher Gore served as senator and governor of Massachusetts. Known as Gore Place, the Charles River flowed close by, and it was referred to as the Monticello of the North. In 1856, the estate was bought by Theophilus Wheeler Walker, a Boston businessman involved in the textile industry. He was related to the Gores by marriage. He never married and lived there alone for the first 10 years. In 1861, his nieces, Maria Sophia Walker and Harriet Sarah Walker, came to live there after the death of their mother. He died in 1890 and bequeathed the estate to them. These were the two spinster sisters who lived on the estate when the workmen witnessed the apparition at the boathouse. Coincidentally or not, only a few months after Mary Walker died in 1904, a decomposed body was found in Walker's Pond. Even then, it was known as the Haunted Pond. The body was so decomposed, identification could not be made. Then Mrs. Joseph Charbonneau came forward and claimed it was her husband, who had disappeared from his home on June 18th. For months, his relatives knew nothing of what happened to him. On the strength of her statement, the body was buried under the name of Joseph Charbonneau. The dead man had a history of public intoxication and committing petty theft, so it was not a stretch of the imagination to believe he ended up dead due to some misadventure. On November 5th, when Mrs. Charbonneau was to have been paid the proceeds of her husband's life insurance, a letter arrived. It stated that Mr. Charbonneau was living at the house of Margaret Toner on Watson Avenue in Lowell. Considering that Margaret Toner had her own run-ins with the police for drunkenness explains why he was staying there. What became of the duplicitous husband is unknown. Upon Mary Walker's death in 1904, she willed $1 million and the estate to the Episcopal Diocese of Boston as a site for a cathedral. By then, the estate covered 128 acres located partly in Waltham and partly in Watertown. The idea of a cathedral did not meet with the approval of the Board of Trustees. In 1908, the diocese put the Gore Walker estate up for auction. This included all the furnishings. A large chandelier that hung in the parlor sold for $125, and the billiard table, which had unusual workmanship, was also hotly bidded over. Part of the grounds were sold, and a sawmill was set up on the grounds. In the process, they destroyed many of the trees. The house was sold to Frederick S. Simmons. After obtaining the property, he convinced several prominent citizens to invest in a gold mine in the western United States. He secured a large amount of money, and then shortly thereafter he disappeared from Waltham. His creditors seized the property, and then the Episcopal Diocese stepped in to protect their interest on the outstanding mortgage. They sold it to Charles H. Metz, automobile manufacturer, who ended up turning it back to the bank. After this, it became the Waltham Country Club and Golf Course in 1921, which did well but only for a while. In 1934, the country club was once more up for auction, but they had no bidders. It was noted the place had proved a white elephant to all connected with it, since it was donated to the Episcopal Diocese by Mary Walker. In 1936, it was taken over by the Watertown Historical Society, and the Gore Place Society of Waltham was housed there. Present-day Gore Place offers guided tours. A mystery that remained unsolved was the identity of the man who was discovered in the pond and buried in Charbonneau's Place in 1904. Also, who was a prior owner seen rowing on the pond on its ghostly reenactment? Was it Christopher Gore or Theophilus Walker? Which, by the way, they're describing a man, one of these two gentlemen, rowing out to the pond with a red lantern, which, by the way, back then a red lantern usually was used only for brothels. This was the euphemistic way, you know, of some of these higher, because there were certain places that were red light districts where you knew this was, all the houses there, these were the brothels. But sometimes they would have some of these brothels which were either one, more upscale, or sometimes they even operate just on brothels only on the weekends. And a discreet way that they would, you know, get the word out is that they would put out a red lantern, which of course that's how that term red light district comes about. So it makes you think, okay, why, and the reason I guess is there's only two prior owners. When these workmen saw, it's either Theophilus, all right, he was a bachelor, and the other one was Gore, and he was, both were outstanding citizens. First of all, why were they hunting, and of all things, with a red lantern rowing out to the middle of the pond? Also, it's never explained that even when that body turned up, the decomposed body, even then, it was known as the haunted pond. How it got to be known as that, it's never clear. And then, of course, we get to, here's this beautiful, beautiful estate, over 100 acres. Burns down, it's redesigned by the Gores based on architecture from Europe. They tour all over the place. They send back furniture. So this place is beautiful by all accounts. But for some reason, after the spinster sisters leave, nobody wants it. Or something happens like a white elephant. And from what I understand, it was very beautiful. The workmanship, and you could think, well, and sometimes you think of it, when this place was built, to hire people to work, your gardeners and all the people that you would need to upkeep one of these properties, you could afford it. I guess fast forward like 100 years, give or take, and all of a sudden, I don't know, the cost of upkeeping it would be more. It's a weird, you don't quite understand why this beautiful property, this estate, they don't want to make it a cathedral. Um, why it becomes the way it does. Besides the haunting or whatever was going on in that pond, it's never really fully explained why this beautiful estate that at one point is even a country club, and it had a golf course and you name it. And of course, this is to bring in, your like the country club set kind of deal. Why just never, just always, it's left. They even had, it would go up for auction. It couldn't even be sold unless it went up for auction. So there you go. That's another mystery. Now back to Stranger Than Fiction stories. Next story is titled Murder at Mingo Ditch. Earl Weissman, 25, and George Shanks, 44, were serving prison terms at the Missouri State Penitentiary. They were convicted of killing Arthur Robinson in 1934. The only thing left of Arthur was a small pile of human bones and teeth found in the ashes of a huge log fire in the banks of Mingo Ditch, about 8 miles southwest of Puxico, just outside his cabin. Arthur Robinson was 30 years old, a bachelor, and had been missing for 10 days. His neighbors were mystified, but then they found what they believed were the still smoking remains of Arthur. Police were called and they continued in their search to confirm if the missing man had indeed become a victim of foul play. A pair of bloody overalls were found behind the stove in his cabin, also shredded, underwear, and a club, both spattered with blood. All this pointed to the conclusion that Arthur was killed. An inquest ended with a verdict of death by unknown parties. Sheriff Barham soon made an arrest. Earl Weissman, who lived across the river in Butler County, was detained when William Smith, Robinson's brother-in-law, pointed out that he was wearing clothes that belonged to the dead man. The sheriff also found other items that belonged to Arthur Robinson inside the man's house. One of these was a 12-gauge single-barrel shotgun. Weissman said he bought everything from Robinson and the clothes were bought at a store in Poplar Bluff. The arrest of George Shanks soon followed, since police suspected he was implicated in the crime. When the police arrested Shanks, he was told the charge involved deserting his wife. With an oath, he told the sheriff he had not deserted her, it was the other way around, and that she left him to go live with Arthur Robinson. Once he was told his arrest was due to Robinson's murder, he just denied knowing the man altogether. Arthur Robinson built his log cabin a year before along the St. Francis River. He made money by farming a little, hunting, and cutting timber. His nearest neighbor lived almost a mile away. He was known to wander around and frequently visit with his neighbors despite the distance. They reported the last time they spoke to him was several days before, when he was trying to rent his property. When he was not seen or heard from, the neighbors went searching for him. After the arrest of Shanks and Wiseman, the police were looking for Shanks' wife. Once they caught up with Flotty, she told Sheriff Barham that her husband had threatened Robinson's life. By then the police theorized that Robinson had been beaten with a club and dismembered with an axe, and finally thrown into the fire to get rid of the evidence. The motive being Robinson's relationship with Flotty Shanks. The state was confronted with a problem when trying to prove their case. The only facts were that someone was murdered in Arthur Robinson's one-room shack, and that an attempt was made to hide the crime by destroying the body with fire. The bones and teeth found in the fire could not be proved to belong to Arthur Robinson. However, circumstantial evidence mounted against the two men arrested, especially after Robinson's wallet was found in Weissman's possession. Inside there was a photograph of Robinson's niece. However, one of Robinson's neighbors gave a statement that Weissman once approached Robinson about buying the wallet from him. Several neighbors gave statements as to the movement of Arthur Robinson and the accused men. Some pointed to the men's innocence in the crime, others cemented Shanks' motives, since he denounced Robinson and made threats against him. It still did not prove that Arthur Robinson was dead. This became a moot point when on February 9th, Earl Weissman made a confession in the killing and burning of Robinson's body. Accounts told to police described Robinson as a bad actor who kept Shanks' wife and sister at his home when Shanks was away. Robinson swore to get the other man's wife. In his confession, Weissman said that one night in January 1934, he was on his way to see his girlfriend. Shanks stopped him, and they walked down the railroad tracks. He told him Robinson had threatened him. He lent Shanks a .38 pistol that he carried on him and accompanied the other man to Robinson's home. The role Weissman played was lookout, and he stood outside as Shanks entered the home. After 5 minutes, a shot rang out. Shanks came out and said, "I got him." Weissman agreed to come back the next day to move the stuff and burn the house. Shanks said he would do the rest. Weissman said he never saw the body but found ashes on the floor covering up blood. When he returned to the house the following Monday, he didn't see Shanks again until they were put in jail together. The February 9 headlines described how 3 persons were being charged with the murder of Arthur Robinson. The tie hacker whose dismembered and charred body was found Friday in the ashes of a brush fire close to his cabin. Eventually 4 persons were arrested for the murder of the Puxico tie hacker. They were Mr. and Mrs. Shanks, Earl Weissman, and Laura Spencer. According to Sheriff George Barham, the burned body was identified by fillings in the teeth. The axe which the body was allegedly dismembered with was found hidden 4 miles from the victim's cabin. Shanks denied the entire version of the story as described in Weissman's confession. The state dropped charges against Mrs. Shanks and her sister Laura Spencer, but placed them under appearance bonds as witnesses for the state. At the hearing for the men, scheduled for February 15, 1934, 125 friends and relatives showed up. 43 witnesses appeared, consisting mostly of people who lived where the crime was committed. Two defense witnesses, Sanford Gritter and Willis Whiffen, who appeared at the trial, were placed under arrest, evidence having been discovered that implicated them in the murder of Arthur Robinson. What this evidence was, or if this was a maneuver to silence defense witnesses, was never explained. The case was carried forward on a strong chain of circumstantial evidence linked by the prosecuting attorney Henry Phillips and Sheriff George Barham. Without a body, Weissman's confession allowed the state to proceed with the charges. Another clue, never voiced in court, was that authorities found in their investigation that Art Robinson seemed to have been a backwoods Romeo. If a woman was married or engaged, didn't stop him from romancing her. It seemed the supposed bachelor had earned the enmity of the men in the area, thus there were plenty who had motive to kill him. George Shanks and Earl Weissman were convicted and sentenced to 20 and 10 years respectively for the murder of Arthur Robinson, to be served at Missouri State Penitentiary. On March 8, 1935, an article ran in a local Missouri newspaper describing how Arthur Robinson's ghost had been sighted. It all started when Sheriff Lester Massingham received a letter from Joe Hume in Croker, Arkansas. It turned out that Arthur Robinson was not a bachelor after all, and Mr. Hume had married his widow. Her half-brother, Belmont Ham, 14, claimed to have seen and talked with Arthur Robinson in Little Rock at the Pacific Missouri Railroad yards. One has to wonder if Joe Hume questioned the validity of his marriage or if his wife had committed bigamy after this encounter. The sheriff from Stoddard County and Butler County interviewed the boy right away. Belmont said, "Yes, sir, I saw him. I met him several weeks ago in the railroad yard at Little Rock. I walked up to him and asked, 'Ain't you Arthur Robinson?' And he said, 'Yes, but how do you know? You're supposed to be dead, and Earl Weissman and George Shanks are doing some days for the murder in the state pen.' The dead man replied, 'They ought to be doing life.' The boy was distantly related to Robinson and, according to him, knew him well. Belmont told authority, 'We slept together that night in a refrigerator car, and he tried to get me to go with him to Nevada, Missouri.' Sheriff Massingham learned that Tom Foster, another neighbor, talked with Robinson on the streets of Poplar Bluff. There's no mention of law enforcement's effort to corroborate this encounter. On March 7th, Sheriff Massingham said he would make no further attempt to find Arthur Robinson, stating, 'If Robinson is alive, he will show up.' Needless to say, Robinson never showed up alive, which would make sense if he staged his demise. According to the authorities, they knew they had the right men, because otherwise, why would anyone confess to a murder they didn't commit? No further investigation was made whether it was true if Arthur Robinson was alive or not, and if perhaps the charred body belonged to someone else. Was it so strange to believe a man crafted a plan to leave an unwanted wife behind, stage his own murder, and perhaps kill another to take his place in a pyre? Or perhaps Arthur Robinson, the seducer of other men's wives, ran across an unforgiving husband with a bent for murder. Those who could shed some light on the truth are long buried. In 1953, Fred Dickinson wrote an article detailing the entire affair for the local newspaper. Again, the gist of the story is that Arthur Robinson was killed because of his dalliance with different women in the area. Think about it. They're saying he was last seen walking around to his neighbors. I'm talking about here about the supposed victim, Art Robinson, because he's trying to rent out his place. Was he going somewhere? And he's running around romancing any woman that crosses his path, whether she's married, not married, has a boyfriend, has a fiance. He doesn't care. Yeah. So you know that there were plenty there that were ready to, like, probably were ready to, yeah. In other words, this was not one person. And he apparently Shanks, when he was away, his wife was spending time with Arthur Robinson. So there was something about him. So yeah, but there you go. It's never. There's no way really that I was able to find out what happened to these two men after they were sent to the penitentiary. Whether they were paroled early, whether they did their entire sentence, or whether they even died in jail. Some of these, well, no, most of these prisons were pretty rough, as far as things went. But and I don't think that Art Robinson, and here he is running around and he's married. He's left his wife behind. And then one wonders, because remember this happened where he's supposedly seen walking around in this little town close by, not too long after his supposed murder. All right, because remember they're saying March 8th, 1935. This is when supposedly his ghost, as in, and this happened like the year before, in 1934, when this whole thing. They were convicted in 1934, and back then, you know, the law moved swiftly. So basically, within a year, he's seen, his ghost is seen, or there's people saying, "Hey, we've talked to him. He's alive." And in the interim of all of this, his wife is remarried, and it makes you wonder, when did she marry this other man? Right away, or was she a bigamist? In other words, that she married without really knowing what had happened to her husband. It's very weird. It's a very weird. There's enough motive to see why he could have gotten killed, maybe by these men or by any other. But then at the same time, you have a couple of eyewitnesses who are saying, no, we spoke to him and he's alive and well. And it looks like he was hopping a train to just leave town. Hmm. What do you think? Was it murder at Mingo Ditch or nothing like that? Or what they were saying, that if it was Robinson who got out, who was burned in the pyre? Who, like people will leave a body to, in other words, not only am I gonna leave town, but I want to make it look like I died. Well, if that's the case, who was it? Who was found dead over there? Okay, next story out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories is titled Creepy Archaeological Discoveries. Skeletons discovered in long forgotten graveyards provide proof of not only gruesome deaths, but the poor quality of life they led. The Gladiators Cemetery. The Romans founded York, then known as Eboracum, around 71 AD. In 2004, a housing development unearthed an unexpected find at Driffield Terrace in the UK. Turned out to be the graveyard for about 80 skeletons, with 60 being totally complete. The settlement dated back to when the area was part of the Northern Roman Empire and was in use until the late 4th century. 75 skeletons belonged to tall men, aged in their mid-40s. Each had been decapitated and the heads placed between their legs or on their body. They were buried inside the city precincts, and it was common for defeated gladiators to be decapitated. There was evidence of trauma on the bones, which indicated they were either gladiators or soldiers. However, the care for which they were interred points to them being gladiators. One of the skeletons bore a large carnivore bite mark on his pelvis, probably inflicted by a lion, tiger, or bear. This supports the theory that it was probably a gladiator who belonged to bestiary who specialized in fighting animals. The wounds the men suffered during live shows, they were medically treated. This correlates with the fact that owners of gladiators saw them as investments worthy of being treated for injuries so they could fight again. 7 of the remains were processed for genetic profiles. 6 were from Britain, and 1 was a Ptolemaic, Egyptian, or from the Near East. The presence of some women's skeletons is still unexplained. These men might have lived violently, but they were given a respectful burial. Grave goods were buried with them, and there's evidence of funeral feast, which was a custom of the Romans at the time. One man was buried with joints of meat from pigs, cows, and horses. Probably had a big appetite. Again, so yes, like when you see that movie of Gladiators, it's it's a comparison, but just like the football teams where they see their players as investments, you know, same thing. You had guys who owned these gladiators and they were seen as investments. So of course they were medically treated, but and I guess most of them. And by the way, when they say in their 40s, that is for those times that was not a young man. That was a pretty full life back then to live into your 40s, especially if that's what you were doing for a living, which is fighting. All right, next strange discovery. She's the Lady of Brifilac. Louise de Quengot, Lady of Brifilac, died in 1656 and was buried at the convent of the Jacobins in northwestern France. Her husband, Toussaint Perrien, Knight of Brifilac, preceded her in death 7 years before. She then became a nun at the convent of the Jacobins. Before being buried, his heart was removed, embalmed, and placed in a heart-shaped urn. This was kept safe until the Lady of Brifilac died when she was in her 60s, and it was placed inside her tomb with her. It was inscribed thus, quote, "This is the heart of Toussaint de Perrien, Knight of the Brifilac, whose body lies at the Savior near Carhaix in the convent of the Discalced Carmelites that he founded and died at Rennes the 30th of August 1649." End quote. Examination of her remains found she was not embalmed and her heart was missing, which means it was probably buried with her husband. His grave was close to hers. Pathologies revealed arterial atherosclerosis, bilateral kidney stones, bilateral pleural adhesions, and an intentional cranial deformity. There were no signs of trauma on her body to explain her death. The other four lead coffins, which were usually reserved for wealthy aristocrats, also had urns in the coffins with the deceased, indicating the hearts of their spouses had been buried with them. During a rescue excavation in 2014, the lady's well-preserved body was found at a construction site in Rennes. Sealed in a lead coffin, she was wearing a cape, brown twill dress, a linen shirt, stocking, and dark-soled shoes. Her face was covered by a shroud, two bonnets, and a cap held by a headband. Her lead coffin was one of 5 among 800 graves. She lay in repose under a stone tomb in the chapel of St. Joseph Convent, which dates back to 1369. The convent grounds became a cemetery until 1793, when the French Revolutionary Army began to use it as a barracks and a sports club. Rennes is an ancient city that dates back 2,000 years and was first a Gaulish village named Condat or Condate. Due to its location along the Via Ossismi, the Romans considered it an important settlement. In 275 AD, they constructed a city wall to keep the settlement safe from barbarians. Louise de Quengot was reinterred in September 2015 after consulting with her descendants at a cemetery in the shadow of the Chateau de Tonquédec, which in the 17th century belonged to her brother. Next creepy discovery is the Aconcagua mummy. In 1985, mountain climbers in Argentina found the mummified remains of a 7-year-old boy sacrificed about 500 years ago. He had been left to die of cold at 17,500 feet. He was found covered in vomit, red pigment, and fecal remains. Like the story made into a film, The Hunger Games, the Inca people offered their children as tribute in a practice called capacocha. The most substantial requirement was to be an unblemished virgin. Parents of the children were forbidden to show grief during the event of when their child was chosen. It's confirmed that prior to sacrifice, the victims were cared for, including their diet. Examination of the child's remains reflect that in the year and a half before his death, his diet consisted primarily of maize, quinoa, capsicum, potatoes, and charqui, which is meat from a llama. Before the child was chosen for the sacrifice, his diet was primarily marine-based. Once a child was chosen, they would be sent to the city of Cusco. It's believed the children were chosen from the families of chiefs. When they arrived at Cusco, there was a celebration involving animal sacrifice and symbolic marriages to other groups within the Inca Empire. Sometimes older children of lower status were sacrificed as servants. After a time of preparation, the victim would be trekked to the sacrificial site high on a mountain or volcano, and then drugged before being walled alive to die of exposure. The children chosen for capacocha were between the ages of 6 and 15. Some mummies have been found with trauma to the skull, and there is debate if they were not knocked out to lessen their suffering. Yeah. Also in the Himalayas, the Tibetans, the same thing. They thought of the mountains as sacred places and there were gods, or the god, or the mountain itself was a god. So yeah. Now, due to the extreme cold and dry conditions of its high altitude burial location, the remains were well preserved. DNA was extracted from the Aconcagua mummy via a lung biopsy, and the mitochondrial genome was sequenced. A new haplogroup, which had not previously been found in modern populations, was found and named C1b1 or C1bi. It's believed to be about 14,000 years old. This is familiar with the Wari people, which predated the Inca. The Y-DNA analysis showed the boy's male lineage is closest to the Chapca people from Huancavelica, a Quechua-speaking population, and clusters closer to modern Quechua-speaking people from Aymara-speaking peoples. Recent analysis of DNA from ancient occupants of Machu Picchu and Cusco found that the people originated from different regions and confirms the Inca practice of macunas, which is the forced resettlement of large amount of people to be used as forced labor in certain areas. Populations were moved from southern Colombia to the north of Chile, Ecuador, Bolivia, and northwest Argentina. So there you go. Yeah, those Incas. Yeah, they had a very small population of the movers and shakers over, I think it was 10 million people. Next story in these weird, creepy archaeological discoveries is titled The Boy in the Tree. 2015, a winter storm in Collooney, Ireland blew over a beech tree that was over 200 years old. Workers found a mass of bones entangled in the exposed roots. The skeleton belonged to a teenager who died between 1030 and 1200 AD. He measured 5 feet 10 inches in height, which was tall for the times he lived in. This indicates he came from a Gaelic family with good social status. His ribs and hands showed signs of knife marks, confirming he died a violent death. He was stabbed repeatedly in the chest, and the wounds to his hand indicates a defensive posture during the attack. Despite evidence he might have been murdered, he was given a formal Christian burial. His shallow grave was aligned east-west, and he was placed in the grave with his hands folded over his pelvic region. Records dating back to the 19th century indicate a church and graveyard were somewhere in the vicinity, but since no other remains have been found, it's not known if perhaps he was murdered and his corpse secreted away. So, he died a violent death. There's no other corpses around him, so it wasn't a cemetery burial. But he received a Christian one, so why did they hide the body? Who knows what the story is on that one. Okay, next one is the skeletons of Atapuerca. In a cave in the Atapuerca Mountains in northern Spain, the bones of 28 persons of various Homo species was found. This 430,000-year-old graveyard received remains placed there purposely. One of the skulls had a wound on it that couldn't be explained by a fall or post-mortem trauma. This indicates the person was murdered either with an axe or a spear. The location is known as the Cima de los Huesos, or Pit of Bones. It is about 100 feet underground and 1,500 feet from the cave system's nearest entrance. Bone fragments found in the Grandolina cavern date back to 800,000 years ago. This is the oldest known hominid settlement in Western Europe. In 2013, DNA was taken from a thigh bone of a person who died 400,000 years ago. The mitochondrial DNA did not match Neanderthals, which was the initial theory, but closer to Denisovans that lived in Siberia. In 2008, in a cave called Cima del Elefante, or Pit of the Elephant, an adult human jawbone was found that dates back to more than 1.1 million years. By these findings, it is evident that this cave system was used by several different series of humans throughout thousands of years. Tools and animal fossils were also recovered, which proves that animals were butchered in the cave. Pollen found in the remains of small animals indicate the environment was a humid forest landscape. The deformed skull of a girl who lived to be around 12 years old was also found in the pit, which suggests the tribe cared for her. There's a hint of something human caring for the disabled. Another find in Atapuerca were the remains of an older man with severe back problems, which could not have taken care of himself unless the community provided for him. In 2010, the Neanderthal genome was first sequenced. This revealed the Neanderthals interbred with modern humans. Neanderthal genes in modern humans is apparent by lighter skin color. The gene variant on chromosome 9 is carried by 70% of Europeans today. Another Neanderthal gene variant regulates keratinocytes, which protects the skin against ultraviolet radiation. Another variant is associated with a greater risk of sunburn, and around 66% of Europeans carry a Neanderthal allele linked to poor tanning ability. So there you go. A lot of these theories about ancient humans are being overturned because they thought they couldn't interbreed, and there was. And Denisovans that were found in Siberia, there's somebody here with that genome. So I think there's a lot more to learn about ancient humans. A lot. Okay, next creepy archaeological discovery is the fate of John Torrington. It was the mid-19th century and explorers all hoped to make history. Such was the case when Sir John Franklin organized an Arctic expedition in 1845. The aim was to navigate the Northwest Passage. They sailed with 3 years' worth of food and 134 men on board the HMS Terror and the HMS Erebus, which was, no, I'm sorry, with 3 years of worth of food and 134 men on board. The HMS Terror and the HMS Erebus were trapped in ice off King William Island, which failed to melt during 2 succeeding summers. In 1859, a letter dated 1848 was found under a cairn in Canada's Victoria Point. It was written by Francis Crozier, who took command of the Terror after Admiral Franklin died. He noted that 24 men perished and the rest of the crew were heading out in hopes of reaching a trading post hundreds of miles away. They all died along the way. The British Navy sent out search parties, but not until 1850 did they stumble on an unexpected clue of what happened to the expedition. On uninhabited beachy island, 3 unmarked graves dating to 1846 were found. In 1854, a Scottish explorer came across Inuits in Pelly Bay who had some of the belongings of the Franklin crew. They told of piles of human bones scattered in the area, some of them cracked in half, which indicated the men had fed on each other before they froze to death. During the 1980s and 1990s, further research was conducted on remains found on King William Island, which showed knife marks. Not only did they eat their fellow crew members, they didn't wait for them to die, but killed them, driven by the throes of hunger. In 1984, one of the bodies buried on Beachy Island was exhumed from under 5 feet of permafrost. He was found to be in pristine condition. John Torrington, 20, died on January 1st, 1846. He was neither killed nor cannibalized. He weighed only 88 pounds, indicating he was malnourished. He had deadly levels of lead inside his body. Possibly the crew's canned food was poorly packaged and became poisonous. The 3 corpses found on Beachy Island remain buried there to this day. The Erebus was discovered in 2014 in 36 feet of water off King William Island, and the HMS Terror was found 2 years later in Terror Bay, 45 miles away from the Erebus. Why the ships separated is unknown. Another mystery is why the Terror sunk, since there was no breach in the hull, and it wasn't crushed by ice. It appeared to have sunk swiftly and suddenly and settled gently to the bottom. What happened? Interesting, huh? Now, the another creepy is the first leper. In 1997, a 4,000-year-old skeleton found in Rajasthan, India, was identified as the first case of leprosy. Balathal, where the remains were found, was an agrarian settlement at the margins of the Indus civilization. There was stigma against this disease even then, since he was buried instead of cremated, as called for by Hindu tradition. The skeleton was found in a stone enclosure filled with burned cow dung, a substance thought to be purifying. This could only be done to those deemed unfit to be burned. Hindu tradition dictates burial when the person is highly respected, or in this case, unfit for cremation. Others that are buried are outcasts, pregnant women, children under 5 years of age, and victims of magic or a curse. Leprosy damages the nerves, which leads to an inability to feel pain, the respiratory tract, skin, and eyes. There's also muscle weakness and diminished eyesight. Symptoms can appear within 1 year, but for some people it can take 20 years. The average incubation period is 5 years. The disease spread from Asia to Europe with Alexander the Great's army after 400 BC. Leprosy originated in Africa during the late Pleistocene, and the bacteria M. leprae spread out of Africa sometime after 40,000 years ago. The bacteria that causes it, Mycobacterium leprae, I'm sorry, is difficult to culture for research and has only one other animal host, the nine-banded armadillo. This is due since armadillos maintain a very low body temperature in which the bacterium can thrive. It's transmitted through contact with droplets from the nose and mouth of an infected person and occurs more commonly among people living in poverty. In the past, leper colonies were established on islands to make sure they did not have contact with the general population. In 2020, there were less than 200,000 cases worldwide, with most new cases occurring in one of 14 countries, with India accounting for more than half of all new cases. And I think what people didn't, I think they realized, because the stigma was that, like they said, you could go for years and years and be infecting like probably family members, which is who you came in closest with, because that's from what I understand, when somebody was found to have leprosy, even the family kept it a secret because they knew that by extension, if the word got out that they had a family member that was a leper, like everybody, maybe they didn't understand the mechanics of how the disease worked, but the family by extension got ostracized because they kind of knew that they you could have been around the leper all this time. You could have been contracted the disease, and just because maybe you didn't show the, I guess, the symptoms, that didn't mean you couldn't infect anybody else. So yeah. Okay, the next one is called the unlucky acrobat. In 2008, evidence of human sacrifice was found in an ancient building in Nagar, a city that belonged to Mesopotamia's Akkadian Empire, presently known as Syria. Three human skeletons, all headless, lay side by side next to several mules and an array of valuable metal objects. One of the human remains showed unusual injuries and overdeveloped areas for ligaments and bones, indicating he was possibly an acrobat. Under mysterious circumstances around 2300 BC, these entertainers apparently ranked high enough in this ancient city's social sphere to serve as sacrificial offerings. Once the bodies were left there, it was filled with dirt and abandoned. This initially made archaeologists believe it was a random killing. However, the building was formerly used for breeding and trading mules used to pull war wagons and the king's chariots. The spot was the center of a temple dedicated to Sakan, or which also goes by the name of Samugan, Samagan, or Sumukwan, god of animals of the steppe or the shepherd of everything. This seemed an unusual place to dispose of random dead bodies. Further inspection points to the possibility they were killed ritualistically to represent a deliberate sacrifice of valued creatures. It's believed they were members of a mysterious group of people called Brak Nagar, known in the text as Hub or Hubki or Hubkai, which could be translated as acrobat, juggler, or horseman. The donkey bones found with the bodies were thought to be draft animals, but considering the building was associated with hybrid Kunga equids, which preceded the use of horses in Mesopotamia, there is a significance to the three humans left there. A genome sequence of these animals found that they are hybrids between female domestic donkeys and male hemipes or hemepes, which are Syrian wild asses. Ancient cuneiform texts record that 43 courtyards in the building housed these animals. These same sources indicate these were very expensive to buy and keep. Silver jewelry was found on top of the fill that covered the bodies. It's theorized the building was abandoned and closed by ritual due to a natural disaster. So, the poor acrobats, or whoever they were deemed, we're going to sacrifice you when we close down this temple for the breeding of these hybrids. And who knows why that would have happened to begin with, but there you go. Talk about unlucky. Yeah, that'll do it. Okay, next story, also out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, is called The Cursed Theaters. Is there any truth to the unwritten law that any business built on consecrated grounds is bound to fail? There was one establishment that violated this belief more than any other, which were theaters. These are stories where misfortune haunted these places. The Brooklyn Theater was built on the site of the old St. John's Protestant Episcopal Church, also known as Hope Chapel. It was situated opposite Washington Place on Broadway between 4th Street and Astor Place. As noted in 1876 by the St. Louis Globe-Democrat, quote, "Here the ill-fated Henry Drayton and his wife gave their parlor opera entertainment. Here the Holmans, Elise Holt, Lena Edwin, and others met with financial disaster until finally the building was burned to the ground, incurring a heavy loss upon all concerned." End quote. Henry Drayton, a well-known opera singer, died from a stroke at age 49 in 1872. He left his wife destitute and without any money to bury him. Several theater managers took a collection so that he could be interred at Cypress Hill Cemetery in Brooklyn. She kept working in the theater. On December 6, 1876, the Brooklyn Theater went up in flames, and the fire spread to the entire block. It originated on the stage when the gas set fire to the drapes. This occurred halfway through the last act of The Two Orphans. The blaze spread quickly and burst out the doors on Washington Street. The damage cost about $250,000. Smoke filled the theater, and fainting women were trampled in the aisles. Some jumped out of the windows and were severely injured. The theater company got out safely except a flyman named John Cumberson, who was badly burned, and threw himself out of a second-story window to his death. Later, Henry Murdoch and Claude Burroughs, two actors, were found dead. They were recognized by their clothing. Murdoch's body was missing its arms and legs. Those who were injured were taken to the Long Island College Hospital. By the next day, about 300 bodies burned beyond recognition were recovered. The theater had seating for 1,800 persons. A common grave was dug at Greenwood Cemetery for 103 unidentified victims. Many of those who lost their lives were seated in the highest tier, which offered the cheapest seats. Only one stairway offered a way of escape, and it quickly became jammed with desperate people trying to escape. It was then noted the Brooklyn Theater did not have a brilliant record. It was built by F.B. Conway and his wife in 1871, and they ran it efficiently. However, the Conways died in rapid succession. He in September 1874, and his wife, who was only 41 years old, in April 1875. Mrs. Conway lost $12,000 in the venture. After Mrs. Conway's death, it was managed not so well by her daughters. Coincidentally, the play The Two Orphans was the same one playing when Mrs. Conway died and the theater caught fire. It was next leased to Theodore Moss of Wallach's Theater, but Mr. Wallach refused to lend his name to the enterprise. Moss backed out of the deal when he realized he could not benefit from Wallach's name and forfeited what he had paid. Due to its high rent, it sat unoccupied until it was taken over by Messrs. Shook and Palmer. The theater never covered its expenses while being operated by them. This is something that was written up about the Brooklyn Theater. The Brooklyn career of the late Mr. and Mrs. B.F. Conway was one that, up to the time of their occupancy of the doomed house, was peculiarly brilliant and successful. At their old house, the Park Theater, they gave a series of legitimate entertainments that did a good deal to keep the steady Brooklynites in their own city at night, to patronize home amusements, and so successful were they that they amassed nearly $80,000 by their venture. The success of the Park Theater induced some leading Brooklynites to erect a more pretentious establishment and compete with the New York houses for popular favor and patronage. Casting around for a site, they came across St. John's Church and Burying Ground, the location of which, contiguous to the leading thoroughfare, appeared to them to be the most advantageous that could be found in the city. The ground was purchased, and about 5 years ago, the old church was torn down and the Brooklyn Theater erected at a cost of over $200,000. Those who had friends in the cemetery and possessed the necessary funds had the bodies removed, but there were many who did not possess the funds. Others who had moved away from the city. And so it was that when the theater was built, many bodies remained in the vaults, and it was averred that in damp weather the exhalations from there made the actors' dressing room almost unbearable. It is avowed by friends of the late Mrs. Conway that although a woman of sound, practical, common sense, From the moment of the selection of the site, she expressed the strongest aversion to it, declaring that what she considered the desecration would inevitably result in disaster, and to her dying day she maintained this belief. Notwithstanding her fears, and in some measure those of her husband, the theater was built and the Conways took possession of it as lessees. It is needless to rehearse now the sad story of their failure, nor how they sunk in the new house everything they had made in the old. It seemed that, end quote, it seemed that many could not forget that the Brooklyn Theater was built on the site of a church and its adjacent graveyard. Before long, stories circulated that it was haunted. If it was shut up at night, as soon as the lights were extinguished, scenery on the stage would flap in a strong wind with no earthly source. Those passing the theater in the night would hear strange noises and shadowy figures flitted in and out of the doorway. The Conways' living quarters were in the highest floor, and once darkness fell, Mrs. Conway refused to enter the theater. Her fear that something supernatural walked the halls must have made her life very unhappy. This is the following description. Quote, the crowning blow to her success came about 2 years after the first occupancy of the theater, when one night her husband fell on the stage in a fit of mortal sickness, and 2 weeks later died. On his deathbed he expressed the belief, it is said, that had he left the cursed and haunted Brooklyn Theater alone, he might have lived to a good old age, for he was a man with every indication of stalwart health and longevity. The death of her husband was a great blow to Sarah Conway's sensitive nature, but she was a bold and persevering woman and struggled bravely on to make the Brooklyn Theater a success, having secured the services of John P. Smith as her business manager. Her efforts were, however, unavailing. Things went from bad to worse, and finally, just 2 years after her husband's death, Mrs. Conway died in her private apartments above the theater. Weird and unearthly sounds were heard in the theater that night. Mike, the janitor, with 4 other friends whose names he now refuses to give, were sitting together in his room. Mrs. Smith and her family were at Mrs. Conway's deathbed, and the moment she died, the time taken by Mrs. Smith and Mike corresponding exactly, the janitor and his friends heard raps upon the wall and sighs in the air. Mike says now that he will not swear whether these raps and sounds were supernatural, but he is willing to swear that he heard them and that they caused him and his friends a severe fright. Others have exaggerated these views, but the faithful janitor is evidently too much in earnest about the matter to put anything but the utmost confidence in his story. After the death of Mr. and Mrs. Conway, their 2 pretty daughters attempted to run the Brooklyn Theater, but were no more successful than their parents, until finally it was closed and remained so until Messrs. Shook and Palmer took possession and would seem to have been redeeming it from its old-time misfortune when the fire came to sweep it out of existence. The reputation of the house being haunted never left it. Mr. Thorpe, the stage manager, described that when he first moved into his quarters in the theater, those originally occupied by the Conways, he was told that he would surely see a wandering spirit in the form of a woman. Mr. Thorpe, however, appears to be a man who takes but little stock in ghosts, and he stoutly asserts that the spirit of the dead female never troubled him, nor was he disturbed by any other natural voices. The school life of his clever little daughter Hattie, who was well known to New York and Brooklyn audiences, was made very uncomfortable by the ghost story. Her school companions constantly rallied her upon it, and that poor child actually thought there must be a ghost. So often was she told of it, and so firm were her companions that such an uncomfortable wraith must have some more tangible existence than in mere rumor. Messrs. E. Lamb and H. B. Phillip, 2 comedians, when questioned on the subject, stated that although they had been connected with the Brooklyn Theater for some time, they had heard no noises nor seen any trepidation among any of the employees. Mr. Lamb, though, said he had been told that the house had been built on ground formerly occupied by a church and cemetery, but could give no definite information. At this moment, Mike, who had been the janitor of the building since its occupancy by the Conways, made his appearance and related the experience of himself and friends on the night of Mrs. Conway's death. On being asked if he knew whether the theater had been built on the site of a church, he replied, "Why, of course it was. The other day, when we were digging out the bodies, I found an old gravestone, and I should think that ought to be proof enough." He strictly refused to be interviewed further, and made a precipitous retreat when pressed to tell more of the strange sounds and sights that had been heard and seen. The establishment of the fact that there was a party filled the graveyard where the theater stood suggests, however, a startling theory. It is just possible, even more than probably, that some of the unsightly and disfigured remains discovered amidst the ruins of the fire were those of bodies that had been laid away in the old churchyard. It is well known fact that bodies will sometimes lie in the ground for many years, retaining the flesh and the bones resisting the action of the elements. The disagreeable exhalations experienced in the dressing rooms in damp weather would seem to point to the fact that there were such bodies here, and among the unrecognized dead who were heaped into that ghastly trench at Greenwood last Saturday, who knows but what there may be some who years ago were buried in the St. John churchyard by loving hands, surrounded by all that friendly and tenderness could suggest, to rob the grave of its terror and its gloom. Whether this were so, it will probably never be known. But the finding of the gravestone proves that such bodies there must have been among the remains of the wretched ones, who on the night of that fatal 5th of December met their death amidst fire and smoke. The burning of the theater itself, the ill fortune that attended it before its ruin, and the unexplained noises heard within its walls are all curious coincidences in the history of theaters built upon consecrated ground, and the results that have followed what is looked upon by so many as a desecration. End quote. The story repeated itself where theaters built on hallowed grounds seemed destined to fail. Coincidence? The Brooklyn Theater became an example of how virulent that curse could be. The Unitarian Church, better known as the Church of the Messiah, was erected at 728 or 730 Broadway in 1839. It remained a church until 1864. In 1865 was sold to Alexander Turney Stewart, who converted it into a theater and named it the Broadway Athenaeum. Between then and 1884, it went through 14 different incarnations, the last one being the New Theatre Comique. It burned down 2 days before Christmas in 1884. The fire was discovered by a scrub woman who arrived at 7 a.m. and found the stage ablaze. She ran into the road screaming fire. Luckily, the theater was empty of guests. However, people staying at the Colonnade Hotel next door had to evacuate. The structure was uninsured, and the loss fell entirely on Judge Henry Hilton, who owned the building. To the north of the theater at 32 Broadway, and separated from the theater by a narrow alley, was the Mundorf and Moenck Beer Saloon. In the alleyway was a famous hole in the wall where actors from the theater would gather to drink copious libations of lager beer and stronger drinks. Quote, was originally the Church of the Messiah, with the Reverend Dr. Osgood as pastor, was transformed by A.T. Stewart into a theater. Buxom Lucy Rushton being the opening star. Here too came the Worrell sisters. Daly first produced The Streets of New York at this house. Poor Mark Smith and Louis Baker ran it as a burlesque theater. Lady Dawn was at one time a star here. It has been variety and concert hall, and to the present time has been a source of pecuniary disaster to many who have undertaken its management. End quote. The 14th Street Theater was located at 107 West 14th Street, just west of 6th Avenue in Manhattan, New York City. It was built in 1866, and within 20 years it was considered an unlucky establishment. It became known as a sinkhole for money that drove men insane and hurried them to their death. It opened for performance of the Théâtre Français and was in the hands of Jouinet and Drevet. The play failed since the majority of theatergoers were American. It subsequently went to the management of different persons who were rich and of fashionable habits. It sat empty since no one had the confidence to lease it. The name was changed to the 14th Street Theater, and it hosted a short-lived English opera. For 3 or 4 years, it was periodically opened for some show, which invariably closed down without warning. Operatic, dramatic, burlesque, variety troupes, none succeeded. Tickets would be sold, and when the theater would be closed, when the time for performance arrived. The theater was the last place notable actor Edwin Forrest played at. He had retired in 1858, but surfaced in 1863 and 1867. In 1881, at the age of 65, he appeared at the 14th Street Theater. The dramatic actor was accused of taking an opportunity to exhibit himself, even if the location was of the poorest sort, and that he was a sovereign egotist, as he had always been. Even the actor's name could not draw crowds as planned, and Forrest demanded his pay each night before going on. If he was not paid, he refused to act, which is why the play closed suddenly. He returned to Philadelphia and died from apoplexy in December 1872, only 10 months after his appearance at the notorious 14th Street Theater, which of course was blamed for his death. The ill luck continued. until they contracted Adelaide Ristori, known also as the Marquess de Grillo, which proved profitable. However, the manager, Jacob Grau, fell ill of an incurable disease and died a lingering death. It was noted if a man gained any financial advantage there, he must suffer in some other way. Grau paid with his life just as Forrest had. When Hezekiah Linthicum Bateman bought the first opera booth to what was then known as the Mortuary Temple, many prophesied ill fortune for him. The French show did well. Afterward, he leased the Lyceum, and when he was at the apex of his prosperity, he died suddenly in 1875 at the age of 62. Many thought the curse of the 14th Street Theater had reached him even across the sea. Watt Sherman owned the establishment in 1875 and suffered a financial downfall. This was attributed to his connection to the theater. Then the theater was leased by Charles Fector and renamed as the Lyceum after the theater he controlled in London. Perhaps he thought this would alter his luck. He was an actor renowned for his roles in La Dame aux Camélias, Hamlet, and Othello. He convinced Sherman Watts he could redeem the reputation of the theater and even gain permission to make vast improvements to to the building. There we go. No one could understand why Watts agreed, since Fector was known to be erratic, impractical, and quarreled with nearly everyone he worked with in Paris and London. In the middle of the renovations, Fector and Watts had a falling out, and Fector was fired. He had spent close to $250,000 in the construction of what was considered an unfeasible project that had to be undone, and the money was wasted. He started to drink in excess and died in 1879 at the age of 54. He was considered a victim of the curse. Next on the bad luck train was J. H. Haverly of Chicago, who had leased different theaters across the country and had always been successful. He dubbed it Haverly's 14th Street Theater. He did well, but only for a time before all his undertakings tumbled with him. Harrigan and Hart had built up a profitable theatrical business. They refused to pay an exorbitant price for a lease at the new park, and instead leased the notorious Home of Destruction. Previously they had crowded houses, however their audiences fell off at once. They steadily lost money, and at the close of the season they retired and were known to cross themselves whenever they passed the building. The partnership was also affected. They ended up dissolving it permanently. The disagreement had started when they were at the 14th Street Theater. The last was Bartley Campbell, a successful playwright. He leased the theater in 1886 and his luck deserted him. He not only lost his money but also his wits. He had a temporary recovery but died in July 1888 at the age of 44 in an insane asylum at Middletown, New York, where he had been confined for 2 years. His cause of death was paresis and softening of the brain, which is specifically linked to syphilis. Upon his death, it was found he had lost a fortune estimated to be worth $350,000, leaving his widow and children destitute. Even before Campbell's death, it was noted it had lost hundreds of thousands of dollars for its owners, managers, and actors. Why had it not been pulled one to give place to something else, considering it was the unluckiest theater in all civilization? Despite its atrocious reputation, by the mid-1910s it was being used as a movie theater. In 1926, Eva Le Gallienne renamed it the Civic Repertory Theater and ran productions and acting classes from it. The Great Depression had the last word and it closed in 1934 and was demolished in 1938. Now, let me tell you something. And I know that actors and people in theater are very superstitious, but let me tell you, that track record's not good. That's not a good track record at all. Okay, next story out of Stranger Than Fiction story is titled The Curse of Amne Machen, or Amne Machen. It all started when George Pereira was directed by a Tibetan shepherd to the cave of a holy man. Pereira had left in March 1920 on a marathon walk from Shanghai across Tibet, China, and then to the Caspian Sea. He was traversing where none had gone before, and by himself. Several months passed until he arrived at the Tibetan holy man's cave. Pereira was surprised to find the man spoke in perfect but archaic Italian, and more so when he learned the man had never left the cave since he was a boy, and Pereira was the first European he had met. The two men discussed Pereira's travels, and then the holy man told him about Amne Machen, which lay hundreds of miles further inside Tibet and was the highest mountain in the world. Pereira was fascinated with the story, but didn't believe it was true, since Everest was known as the highest peak among the Himalayas. The man insisted that Amne Machen was thousands of feet higher. The two men spoke deep into the night about the mountain, and Pereira learned the mountain was protected by dedicated tribesmen and by a curse. There was no doubt a warning was being issued when the holy man said that if he succeeded in slipping past the Golok warriors, then he would be struck down by the curse, which none could escape even if it took months or years. If a man was an unbeliever, he could not escape with his life after laying eyes on Amne Machen. The story whetted Pereira's appetite to see the mountain. He wandered about Tibet and China for a year, following different clues in search of the mythical peak, even though most natives were silent about the subject or warned him away. Then came the day when he saw the point from about 70 miles away. The vast Amne Machen range soared thousands of feet into the clouds and dwarfed other mountains near it. Pereira had seen different mountain ranges in other continents. He had climbed the Himalayan range, the South American Andes, and seen the Canadian Rockies, but he calculated Amne Machen was loftier. He made plans to return to England and organize an expedition. The holy man's warning was forgotten. Pereira arrived at a village on the Tibetan-Chinese border and met the American explorer and botanist Joseph Rock. He told Rock about the mountain, who initially was skeptical. However, 4 years later, despite death threats from the Golok Tibetans, Joseph Rock ventured to within 50 miles of the mountain. The next day after visiting with Rock, Pereira set off towards the coast. A few hours after crossing into China from Tibet, with a caravan train of merchants, he suddenly tumbled from his horse, clutching his chest with both hands. Within moments he died. The Chinese and Tibetans thought he had been struck down by the curse. Their fear was so great they refused to touch his body. It turned out heart failure had killed Pereira, and those who knew him were surprised since he had been such a fit and healthy man. When news reached the outside world, most didn't believe in the mount or that he had been killed by the curse. He had only been in his mid-50s when he set out on the expedition. He was buried in Kants near Batang, Sichuan in October 1923. George Pereira was a British Army officer, writer, diplomat, and explorer. His family was descended from an old Roman Catholic family of Portuguese origins, which had been involved in the 19th century with a Chinese trade in Macau. He served in several battles in World War I, where he was known to the men as Hoppy because of lameness he suffered from after a riding accident. He had served as a British military attaché in Peking from 1905 to 1910 and was fluent in Chinese and had made many journeys into China and Tibet on foot by himself. During World War II, several Allied pilots found they had almost come to grief and barely averted crashing into a mysterious mountain on the Chinese border with Tibet. Their altimeters recorded heights of more than 30,000 feet, almost 1,000 more than Everest. A few years after the war, an American journalist, inspired by the rumors, set off to find Amne Machen and claimed to have found it. The scientific instruments for recording the mountain's height had been damaged by native bearers' rough handling. 3 white men made up the party. One of them was killed by a landslide a few days after the discovery. The second died from typhoid fever in Peking, and the journalist drowned several months later. This story is unverified. The only possible reference is an expedition undertaken in 1948 by Milton Reynolds, a Chicago millionaire. He traveled to China on his plane, the China Explorer, which was a retrofitted Douglas A-26 Invader, supposedly to find Amne Machen. He believed the mountain range was higher than Everest. He hired war hero Bill Odom as a pilot. Odom had flown the air route over the Himalayas from India to China during World War II. The co-pilot was Tex Sally. They ran into problems when they arrived in China, and much of the retrofitting had to be corrected. On April the 1st, the plane lost a wheel on the runway as it taxied to leave. Upon hearing the repair would take weeks, Reynolds canceled the expedition. However, the next day it was flown, as in the plane was flown, to another airport in Shanghai. Then, without getting clearance from the Chinese government, the plane left with the 3 men and returned 13 hours later, having never submitted a flight plan. The plane was held by the government, and the men were told they were to undergo questioning as to where they had gone on the trip. Instead of going to a hotel, the men went to the airport, told the manager they needed to test the engines, and took off with cold engines and only using two-thirds of the runway. The control tower was also not alerted they were leaving. They headed to Japan, where they were escorted by U.S. fighter planes 150 miles from the coast. Chinese officials demanded they be returned. However, General Douglas MacArthur refused. The other part of the expedition, made up by staff from Life magazine and the Boston Museum of Science, were left to answer questions posed by the Chinese government. According to a life photographer, Tex Sally said they had attempted to fly over Amne Machen, but bad weather turned them back. Reynolds' family said this expedition was a cover in which the United States was trying to ascertain if the Chinese were developing nuclear power. Bill Odom was killed 2 years later in 1949 after his plane crashed at the National Air Races in Cleveland. He was 29 years old. Amne Machen is revered in Tibetan Buddhism as the home of the deity of Amdo or Machen Pomra. The entire range is an eastern extension of the Kunlun Mountains. The highest point is measured at 20,610 feet and is 23rd in height amongst the peaks of China. Before the communist takeover, up to 10,000 Golok people would trek 120 miles each year to the summit. The Golok were known as ferocious fighters free from Tibetan and Chinese control. Amne Machen was reached in 1981 by three groups. One from Japan, one from the United States, and the other from an Austrian-German expedition. They did not find evidence of an earlier ascent. Later, that summer, a Canadian group and then an Australian expedition arrived. Around the time of Pereira's expedition to find Amne Machen, three Mount Everest expeditions were mounted in 1921, 1922, and 1924. George Lee Mallory was an English mountaineer who participated in all three. He and climbing partner Andrew Sandy Irvine were purportedly last seen ascending near Everest summit during the 1924 expedition. The mystery of their demise was whether they had reached the summit before dying. In 1933, another attempt was made to scale Everest. An ice axe was found about 60 feet below the crest of the northeast ridge. It was ascertained to belong to either Mallory or Irvine. In 1977, the axe was re-examined and 4 sets of marks were found on the shaft. This was in addition to prior marks found in 1933. In 1999, an expedition reached 26,900 feet, where they established Camp 6. A body was found at an elevation of 26,800 feet. It was partially frozen and well preserved. Tied to the corpse's waist were the remains of a braided cotton climbing rope. It was assumed to be Irving, but when the labels that read G. Mallory, G. Lee, M.A., and a third one were found on the clothing, as well as letters addressed to Mallory, it confirmed they found Mallory and not Irvine. The mountaineers buried the corpse with rocks. This find presented circumstantial evidence that Mallory might have reached the summit first. While efforts were being made to find and climb Amne Machen and Mount Everest, Alexandra David Neal disguised herself to enter Lhasa, which was forbidden to foreigners. She trekked through India and Asia and was expelled in 1916 by the British forces for trespassing into Tibet. Since World War I was underway, she could not return to Europe. She instead studied at monasteries in Korea and Japan, accompanied by Afor Yongden, 15, a Sikkimese Lama who accompanied her on her travels and eventually became her adopted son. The two then trekked 5,000 miles across the Chinese Empire, either on foot or by mule, yak, or horse. This was while the country was in the middle of a civil war. After witnessing battles and having to negotiate with warlords in order to secure passage, they reached the border of Tibet in 1923. They disguised themselves as Tibetan pilgrims. The pudgy middle-aged woman went where no European had gone before, crossing a 19,000-foot mountain pass in winter. It took 4 months to reach the city of Lhasa, where Alexandra laid eyes on the Potala Palace, home of the Dalai Lama since the 7th century. Still disguised, they stayed 2 months in Lhasa until the British discovered them and they were expelled. She returned to France in 1928 and published Magic and Mystery in Tibet. In 1937, she left again, this time reaching Tibet through the Soviet Union. She stayed in the Eastern Highlands and walked around Amne Machen. Alexandra died at home in 1969, just before her 101st birthday. In 2024, 100 years after he disappeared, A National Geographic team found part of Irvine's corpse on the central Rongbuk Glacier at an altitude of at least 7,000 feet lower than where Mallory's body was found. Tragedy in the mountains proved to reoccur among others. Mallory's brother, Sir Trafford Lee Mallory, died on a mountain range when the Avro York carrying him crashed in the French Alps in 1944, killing all on board. Mallory's daughter, Frances, married Glenn Milliken, who was killed in a climbing accident in 1947 at Buzzard's Roost in Fall Creek Falls State Park, Tennessee. Frances Mallory's sons, Richard and George Milliken, became climbers during the 1960s and 70s. In 1995, George Mallory's grandson reached the summit of Everest. On May 16, 2025, it was reported that Philip Santiago, 45, died on May 14th and Subrata Ghosh on May 15th while climbing Mount Everest. It's undecided the bodies were to be brought down since it's a difficult and expensive venture. Two Sherpa support staff who became ill at the Everest Base Camp were evacuated but later died while being treated at a hospital. Earlier in the week, Margareta Moran died above Camp 4 of the 28,169-foot Himalayan mountain. Kanchenjunga is the third highest mountain after Mount Everest and K2. The week before, Alexander Panko died while attempting to climb Mount Makalu, the fifth highest mountain in the world. The months before, an Austrian climber died while descending Nepal's Ama Dablam at 22,349 feet. There are many casualties in what is known as the death zone, where altitude sickness is experienced due to the thin air and low oxygen levels. Everest was first climbed in 1953 by New Zealander Edmund Hillary and Nepali Sherpa Tenzing Norgay. More than 300 people have died on Everest since then. The curse of Mount Everest is a term used due to the high number of deaths and tragedies that have occurred on the mountain. Are these the victims of the curse of Amne Machen or something more pervasive that acts as an undeniable allure that brings men and women to their untimely deaths? In other words, it's the same thing whether it's Everest or Amne Machen, because it makes you think. To climb up, I don't know. I guess I know that some people see it as the challenge, but obviously after so many people die, and they give out permits, you just can't. You have to be prepared. In other words, this is not a cheap undertaking. Present day, I'm talking. You need to be able to get there, to get the permit, to I guess be prepared to go to the summit, and I don't know, to risk your life for something like that. And then of course with Mallory, it was always like if he had died, that at the very least it could say he made it to the summit. In other words, that if he died, it was at least with something, which to me is like better to not have died at all. Okay, next story out of Mysterious Universe, and it's titled Mysterious Unsolved Deaths Linked to UFOs. The UFO phenomenon encompasses a wide range of strangeness, from various inexplicable aerial phenomena to alien encounters to abductions. It all launches itself out into the fringe of times. Despite this, it is not typically a field associated with death. However, over the years there have been many mysterious deaths that are in one way or another linked to the UFOs. One of the earlier, most bizarre deaths supposedly related to UFO is the 1956 case of Air Force Sergeant Jonathan Lovett. In March of that year, Lovett and Major William Cunningham, both of the Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, ventured out into the desolate desert scrub to collect fallen debris from a recent missile test at the White Sands Missile Test Range. And at one point, Lovett went off behind a dune. A few moments later, Cunningham reportedly heard Lovett scream out in terror, and he ran to investigate. What he saw next would cause him to scream as well. According to Cunningham, after going over a ridge, he was met with the sight of a large silvery disc-shaped object hovering around 15 or 20 feet in the air, which had a long snake-like object trailing from it. To his horror, he saw that this appendage was wrapped around the legs of Lovett and in the process of pulling him towards the strange craft. At this point, Cunningham would report that he had been somehow inexplicably paralyzed, wanting to take action but unable to move as he watched his friend get pulled and reeled into the object, after which it sped off at breathtaking great speed. As soon as it was out of sight, Cunningham found himself released from whatever had kept him frozen there. After radioing missile control and telling them what had happened, he was told that they were indeed picking up a radar signature moving rapidly, but that they were not able to tell what it was. Security forces and soldiers immediately descended upon the area and a massive search began, which would go on for 3 days without finding a single trace of the missing man. In the meantime, it was suspected that Lovett had been the victim of foul play and that Cunningham was responsible. His wild story is simply a cover, and that he was detained. On the third day of the search, after meticulously scouring 100 square miles of the landscape, Lovett's body was found around 10 miles from where he had gone missing, and his corpse was in a horrifying state. Besides being completely drained of every drop of blood, there was no sign of vascular collapse, meaning he had not died of bleeding to death, which was very unusual for someone who had been drained of so much blood. An incision had been made in Lovett's lower jaw, through which his tongue had been removed. A cut which extended from the tip of the chin down to his larynx. His anus and genitalia had been expertly removed, as if from a plug, and his eyes had been taken out smoothly. The body showed no signs of decomposition, despite being estimated to have been lying out there in the desert heat for 1 or 2 days. And most oddly of all, there were found to be dead scavengers nearby that had apparently died after trying to feed on the body. None of it made any sense at all, and it still doesn't. This particular incident has its origins in an alleged report called Grudge/Blue Book Report 13, which is mysterious in many ways in and of itself. The manual in question was supposedly analyzed by an information analyst for the U.S. Air Force and former Green Beret named Bill English, and is allegedly dated 1953 to 1963. Upon the cover is written the code AFSN 2246-3, and the words top secret, need to know only, crypto clearance 14 or above required, stamped on it in red ink. Since it is unknown if this document ever really existed or not, and the information given by Billy English is only preserved in his notes and his memory of what he read, it is unknown if the report is real or whether the Lovett case ever really happened in any sense at all, and so it remains shrouded in mystery. In June of 1972, railway employees at a station near Terrassa, Barcelona found in the early morning hours the decapitated bodies of 2 men. This was shocking enough as it was, but could become even stranger when they found cotton balls grasped in their dead grip. In a note on one of the bodies that read, "The extraterrestrials are calling us. We belong to infinity." This short writing was signed WKTS 88. The investigations performed by the police department found that the bodies had been decapitated as they placed their heads over the railroad tracks, and they belonged to Jose Felix Rodriguez Montero and Joan Turu Valles. It was all macabre, sensationalized news at the time, but it got even more deeply disturbing as the investigation continued. There would be found reams of letters and notes in the men's possession that were written to ufologist Marius Leggett, the UN, and to friends living in Zaragoza who were UFO nuts. The letter to Leggett read, quote, "Dear Sir, for a long time now, we have been in direct contact with those beings, which in one way or the other you and other earthlings have been studying, the extraterrestrials. They have been mutating us slowly, however, not on the same dates. Please understand, like us, we are all strangers on this planet. From there they are calling us, and we have a long time ago identified them as your friends. We are leaving filled with an immense joy which we have never known. We are headed towards the galactic center. At our homes, you'll find some writings, some data and notes which will serve to teach the unbelieving earthling, you are not one of them, that sentient life expands throughout the infinite universe from an indefinable God. We know that you will believe the moment you read them, since you know that if our passion would have been popularity, we would have obtained of it a long time ago. Cosmic Salute, WKTS 88 or 88. A letter to the UN read, "Dear Sirs, we have been studying your planet since times remote, and given our advanced cerebral state, which is incomparable to that of humans, which cannot conceive the state of stagnation in which humanity finds itself. The comedy that we have been continuously observing on your planet, when some humans have already reached other planets, as in the moon, is inconceivable. Our intervention in the affairs of humanity will not occur until said humanity has already self-destructed It shall occur no more than 300 years. Then we will intervene in your planet's affairs and we will solve all your grave problems. Inevitably, humanity is marching towards self destruction. So continue on with your comedy, your hypocrisy, with your tyranny. Signed, WKDK through WKTS 88. The letter to the friends read, quote, Friends, you will know that the theme of ufology is one that is very passionate for you and has been since a while back. What you don't know is that we have had direct contact with them since the year 1970. Upon receiving this letter, we are sure that by some form of media you have learned that we are now with them, since they have called to us, since our mutation is now total and we are now strangers on this earth. We realized that you would have wanted to know all about this, but we would not have enjoyed the popularity. If they would think like humans, wouldn't you think they would have been the most popular in our solar system? We needed to proceed the same way as they. We are headed to the Galactic Center. In our private library, there are a series of books on cosmic literature, which we gladly offer you with great pleasure. You will study and investigate as much as possible, and who knows, maybe one day you will also be called upon. Cosmic Salute, WKTS 88. End quote. What are we to make of this case? Were these two men in contact with aliens, or were they the two UFO nutjobs who killed themselves in pursuit of some delusional fantasy? Another bizarre case occurred in 1979 when two hunters in the Bliss and Jerome area of Idaho were out hunting when they stumbled across the mostly nude body of a man sprawled out there in the middle of nowhere. When the hunters drew closer, they could see that the dead man was only wearing underpants. But what really caught their attention was that the man had been horribly mutilated, with his sexual organs removed, his lips cut off with surgical precision, and several organs removed with similar expert cuts. What made it particularly odd was that although the country was rugged with many sharp rocks and thorns, the man's bare feet were not scuffed, scraped, or scratched in any way. They were in pristine condition, even though the nearest road was miles away. There were also no footprints around the corpse and no tire tracks. How had he gotten there through the rough landscape miles from the road in his bare feet without a single cut or scratch? Had someone dumped him there? How or why would they have carried him out there without leaving a trace, and why had they mutilated the corpse? Authorities were notified and scoured the area but could find no clues. And it was over a week later that they found the man's possessions, many miles away from the body and similarly in the middle of the woods. It certainly sounds very much like a classic cattle mutilation scenario, and all the more so in that region where the body was found and it had experienced several UFO reports and reports of cattle mutilations at around the same time. Some mysterious UFO deaths have managed to become almost legendary beyond their own circumstances. These are the strange unsolved deaths that are orbited by various weird clues that have never been solved, and which serve to propel them on to a whole other realm of bizarreness, as the speculation and discussion go on. One of the most talked about strange deaths that has managed to become firmly entrenched within UFO lore is that of a humble coal miner in England, who would turn up dead under some very strange circumstances, and whose passing had managed to take on a life of its own to become one of the great unsolved mysteries out there. Zygmunt Jan Adamski was a Polish immigrant who in 1960 had moved to the quaint small town of Tingley near Wakefield in Yorkshire, England. A coal miner by trade, he had a rather simple life, and there was not that much that was particularly remarkable about him. He and his wife, Leocadia, were well liked enough by their neighbors, but other than the wife's multiple sclerosis, they were for the most part unassuming, that is until June 6, 1980, when Adamski would carve out a place for himself in the annals of strange and unexplained disappearances and deaths. That day was the eve of his goddaughter's wedding, and the family was full of good cheer, looking forward to the festivities the following day. It was in good spirits that around 3:30 p.m. Adamski went off to do some shopping for the next day's lunch. As he made his way towards the market, he passed some neighbors who would say that he seemed to be in a good mood, with nothing seeming to be odd. Yet this would be the last time anyone would see him alive. When Adamski did not return that evening, his wife saw it as strange, as the market was just a short walk away down the road. It had been a perfectly pleasant day, and her husband had not mentioned making any other stops or errands. As the minutes turned to hours, she finally contacted police to report him missing. It was soon found that he had indeed made it to the market in Wakefield and had bought his groceries, with the clerk saying he had seemed to be in a cheerful mood. But after that, no one seems to have seen him. A sweep of the area turned up no sign of him. No one had talked to him, and it looked as if he had just evaporated into thin air. He had been happily married and looking forward to his goddaughter's wedding, so it didn't seem as if he would just run off without warning. And although his health had deteriorated in recent years due to his heavy smoking, as he was still mostly able to get around, so it didn't seem likely that he had just gone off somewhere to die. With no clues and no leads as to where he had gone, it was just assumed that he had wandered off and would come back. He never did, and it would not be until 5 days later that his fate would be revealed. On June 11, 1980, a coal worker by the name of Trevor Parker was doing his rounds at Tomlin's coal yard in the town of Todmorden, around 30 miles away from Tingley, when he saw something quite grim at the top of a 12-foot high heap of coal. There, splayed out face up above, was the body of a dead man, and when police were notified, it soon ascertained that this was the missing Adamski. There were numerous strange clues immediately apparent when authorities arrived on the scene. Although he was well dressed in a suit, his shirt was missing, as were his wallet and his watch, and his trousers and shoes seemed to have been put on very crudely, as if they had been taken off and then put back on by a child who didn't know what they were doing. And the suit jacket was also oddly misbuttoned. All of it was curiously lacking smears of coal dust, as if he had been carefully placed there. The wallet and watch might have been taken after death, but why would anyone take his shirt? Or remove his trousers and shoes to put them back on again, and how had he gotten up there? There was also the positioning and condition of the body. It was lying face up on that formidable pile of coal, as if he had just tried to take a nap. Yet there was no sign that anyone had climbed up or down it, the coal undisturbed. There was also no sign of physical injury, struggle, or foul play. Indeed, he was described by officers on the scene as looking peaceful, like he just got into bed and was fast asleep. The only marks that could be found on the body were a series of tiny burn marks on the back of his head, neck, and shoulders, as well as some minor scuffs on his palm, but it would not be determined what had caused these. Making these burns even stranger was that some sort of yellowish, gel-like ointment had been slathered on them, but the coroner could not determine just what the ointment was. Adamski himself was found to have been well fed when he had died, despite being missing for 5 days, and a call to hospitals of the area showed that he had not checked in anywhere, nor was there any sign that he had been living like a tramp on the streets, as his clothes were impeccably pressed and as clean as the day he had left his home. And also he had only 1 day's worth of beard growth. So where had he been? At the time, Police Constable Alan Godfrey pronounced that Adamski had died of a heart attack, but this did very little to answer the myriad questions surrounding the body. Where were his belongings? How did his body get to the top of that pile? What were the burns? And where had he been for the past 5 days? A coroner examination could not conclusively find an exact cause of death, and was forced to go with the heart attack theory for lack of any evidence otherwise. All that could be determined for sure was that Adamski had likely died a day before his body had been found, and that the burn marks seemed to have been inflicted 2 days previously. Theories flew. It was surmised that he may have suffered some sort of shock after sustaining the mysterious burns, after which he had become disoriented and had climbed to the top of that coal pile to look around, finally dropping dead. Yet there was no sign of anyone having climbed the pile, nothing to see there anyway, and the man who had found the body would swear that it had not been there just hours earlier. There was also no evidence at all that Adamski knew anyone in Todmorden, and no clear reason why he should have been there in the first place. Another theory was that he had been kidnapped, and then finally killed and put up on that coal heap. But why dispose of the body there, and how did they do it? Was it lowered with a crane? If that were the case, wouldn't someone notice that? It did not take long for speculation to veer off into the bizarre, as a lot of people were noticing that the area of Todmorden was a hotspot for UFO activity. And indeed, there have been a flap of sightings right around the time Adamski had disappeared. Rather bizarrely, the very same police officer who had first come to examine the scene of Adamski's death, Godfrey, would have his own very weird encounter with the otherworldly when he claims he had seen a UFO and experienced 30 minutes of missing time. His subsequent hypnosis session would be a pretty creepy to say the least, and he would say while under, quote, "They're horrible, small, 3 to 4 feet, like 5-year-old lads. There are 8 of them. He's touching me. He's feeling at my clothes. They have hands and heads like a lamp. They keep touching me. They are making noises. Joseph. I know him as Joseph. He has told me not to be frightened. They are robots. They are not humans. They're robots. They're his. They are Joseph's robots. There's a bloody dog. It's horrible, the size of an Alsatian." Whether this has anything to do with Adamski's death or not is unclear. But the idea here is that a UFO abducted him, performed experiments that left the burn marks behind, and then killed him, perhaps even accidentally, by giving him a heart attack, after which they had redressed him and lowered the body onto that coal pile where it could be found. The media would take the UFO angle and run with it, splashing out headlines that suggested Adamski was killed by aliens, and this went a long way towards sensationalizing it all and muddying the waters. Indeed, because of this, the strange case of Zygmunt Adamski would in later years become more well known as a UFO case than that of a mere mysterious death. And with so many strange clues and a lack of any further evidence, it has remained a favorite theory among many. In more recent years, there have been some little bits of new information that have come in. For instance, there has been evidence by John Hansen and David Sankey of Bufora, the British UFO Research Association, that Adamski might have been involved in a bit of a family feud with his cousin and her husband, leaving open a motive for foul play. It is possible that someone in the offending family could have abducted Adamski and tortured him, explaining the burns, after which he unexpectedly died of a heart attack after making a bid to escape, or had died while being detained and was dumped in a panic, but not before they pilfered the wallet and watch. There's still not much concrete evidence of this, and it does not tie all the disparate, strange clues together, leaving us in the end just as much in the dark as ever. In the end, what are we to make of all the weird clues and pieces of evidence being offered? What happened to Zygmunt Adamski? Whether it be from foul play, suicide, or UFOs, the fact is that the case has never been satisfactorily solved, and it is sure to invite more debate and speculation in the years to come. Perhaps one of the most famous cases of an apparent case of mysterious, inexplicable human alien mutilation occurred in Brazil in 1988. At the Guarapiranga Reservoir was found the body of a man who was in a very strange state indeed. Although it was determined that the person had been dead for several days, there was no smell when it should have been redolent with the stench of decay, no noticeable decomposition, and there was no sign that the body had been fed upon by scavengers or even insects. Upon his body were found to be numerous smooth, round holes, and the man's lips, eyes, tongue, and ears had been cut away with expert precision, not torn or ragged in any way. Other tissues and organs had been removed as well as for reasons unknown, and there were other anomalies in addition to all of this. The coroner tasked with examining the body would later say of it, quote, "Although the victim has been dead for 48 to 72 hours, there was no sign of being eaten by animals and starting to rot, as would be expected. There was no smell, bleeding from the wounds had been minimal, the lips and teeth from the face had been cut away, the eyes, ears, and tongue had been removed. Neat round holes, 1 to 1.5 inches in diameter, had been made in the shoulders, arms, head, stomach, and anus, and tissue and muscles had been extracted. The holes had not been made through which extensive digestive organs had been extracted. The scrotum, but not the penis, had been removed, and all pubic hair had disappeared. The rectum had been cored out. Despite these devastating mutilations, there was no sign that the victim had been bound or struggled in any way." End quote. The mysterious body was photographed in the pictures shown to Dr. Goes Rubens, who concurred that it was all very odd indeed and seemed inexplicable by normal definitions. It was also pointed out by an associate of Rubens that the mutilations on display with the mysterious body had many of the same hallmarks of the more well-known cattle mutilations, such as a lack of decomposition, organs seemingly selectively removed, precision, almost surgical cuts, and anomalous holes bored into the corpse. It appears that the dead man was never identified, and his strange death has from then on many questions surrounding it. Who or what did this to him? Why was there no decomposition? Why were some organs missing and not others, and why had they been removed so cleanly and precisely? Why had these holes been made in the body? Why hadn't the victim struggled or shown signs of being detained? What happened to him, and who was he? We will probably never know. Another case uncovered by UFO investigators Don Ecker supposedly occurred in 1989 when Ecker was contacted by ufologist and cattle mutilation expert William Bill Nell of the Long Island Skywatch organization, who came with a very strange story indeed. Nell claimed that he had been contacted by an assistant medical examiner from Westchester County, New York, who was familiar with Nell's work and needed some advice on a mysterious set of corpses that had arrived at two morgues in New York and one in Connecticut at around the same time and in the same grim condition. Nell would claim that the three mysterious corpses had been mutilated by removal of the face, genitals, eyes, parts from the stomach, the rectum, and thyroids, all in exactly in the same way and apparently on the same night. According to Ecker, these corpses coincided with a number of animal mutilations that were occurring in New York and Connecticut at the time, and that the medical examiner who had contacted Nell had allegedly claimed that the incidents had been immediately concealed from the media and public. The main theory was that these mutilations had been carried out by some sort of satanic cult, which is also often put forward as an explanation for cattle mutilations, but Ecker would disagree, saying, quote, "The satanic explanation was examined and, according to the reporting witness, did not hold water. After having been personally involved in an investigation of cattle mutilations as a police officer back in 1982, I was very familiar with the cult theory of perpetrators. The Idaho Department of Law Enforcement drags it out every time there's a new rash of mutilations. The problem is, and everyone is aware of it, that no one has yet been caught, been brought to trial, or arrested yet for these crimes. Out here in the West, people know that you're flirting with a rancher's bullet if you are caught fooling around with a rancher's cattle. They are his livelihood, and he will defend it, yet the mutilations keep occurring, and no one is any the wiser. Or are they?" End quote. The 1990s brought in an era of shady deaths laced with whispers of dark government and conspiracies in connection to UFOs, with 1993 seeing astronaut Deke Slayton die of an aggressive cancer, conveniently right before he was expected to come forward with his inside knowledge and experience in UFOs. In 1994, an investigator for the Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON, Ann Livingston, died of an extremely aggressive and ferocious form of ovarian cancer. Rather spookily, this happened just a mere 2 years after she had claimed to have been harassed by ghoulish, faceless, pale, and sinister men in black. Also in 1994 was the death of another MUFON investigator, Ron Johnson, who was actually the deputy director of investigations for the organization. He would die under very strange circumstances when, after a slide presentation at a conference in Austin, Texas, the lights came on and he was found unresponsive in his seat, with blood coming out of his nose and a weird purple coloration to his face. A few years later, 1996 saw the death of a UFO author, Carla Turner, who died of breast cancer. Turner was known for constantly attributing her cancer to actions taken by aliens due to some of the things she had written of in her UFO-themed books Masquerade of Angels, Taken, and Into the Fringe. In 1999, author of numerous UFO and conspiracy books, Jim Keith, also died when a blood clot stopped his heart as he was receiving routine surgery for a broken leg. Perhaps one of the most bizarre individuals to have died a suspicious death for their whistleblowing of alleged information on aliens and UFO is the American engineer Phil Schneider. An engineer, geologist, demolition specialist, and civil engineer, Schneider worked for the military and aerospace industries and was allegedly heavily involved with the construction of underground military bases, eventually being assigned to work at the Dulce base in New Mexico. It is here where he would allege that he had come into contact with all manner of information and experiences dealing with aliens, UFOs, and government cover-ups, and he would have quite the bizarre tale to tell indeed. In the 1990s, Schneider began coming forth with what he claimed to be information that he had gleaned from his alleged top-secret security clearance at Dulce. He claimed that aliens had already had a base beneath Dulce, and that his team had accidentally stumbled across it as they drilled in order to expand the base. It apparently wasn't a warm welcome, devolving into what he calls a massacre, and of which he would say, quote, I was involved in the expansion of the deep underground military base at Dulce, which is possibly the deepest base. It descends 7 levels and is over 2.5 miles deep. At this time, we were drilling 4 different wells in the desert, intending to tie them together, but this required blasting. My job was to go deep into the wells, research the characteristics of the black rocks, and recommend the explosives that would be suitable in each case. However, as we made our way down, we found ourselves in a large cavern that was full of extraterrestrial aliens known as the Big Greys. I killed 2 of them. At that time, there were about 30 people there, and 40 more came there later. When it all started, they were all killed. We were surprised by the existence of an entire underground base filled with aliens. Later, we learned that they have been living on our planet for a long time. In my opinion, this can explain a lot of what is behind the theory of ancient astronauts. End quote. The incident would allegedly leave Schneider with severe burns from the aliens' alleged energy weapons, as well as later giving him cancer from the radiation emitted by them. After this rough start and unfortunate misunderstanding, the U.S. government supposedly reached a truce with what Schneider calls the Zeta Reticuli, also known as the Greys, signing a treaty he called the Greyada Agreement. After this, Dulce served as a secret function of serving as a place to house aliens and their technology, as well as to conduct both genetic and mind control experiments using alien technology. He was very specific in detailing the specifics of the base, explained that it was divided into 7 levels, each one housing things such as living quarters, storage facilities for alien craft, alien bodies, and alien embryos, laboratories, housing for such varieties of aliens as greys and reptoids, and meeting halls for conferences with representatives of the alien civilization. Schneider would claim that many of the technologies we take for granted every day, as well as military technologies such as stealth technology, were developed with the help of these aliens, and in exchange, the U.S. government had established numerous secret underground bases for them to carry out experiments on humans. Indeed, there were supposedly 1,477 underground bases built around the world, all as part of their agreement. This isn't even the weirdest part yet. Schneider would claim that the aliens had broken this treaty and that this would boil over into disagreement that often ended in violence. According to Schneider, the Greys were secretly plotting to overthrow the government and install a new world order, all controlled by the UN, which they had infiltrated and secretly controlled. He also claimed that there are 7 benevolent alien species and 4 evil species on Earth. As a result, a resistance movement against some of them has developed, and there are some incidents Schneider says are tied to this. For instance, he would claim that the Bikini Atoll was the site of a nuclear explosion not to test the bomb, but to wipe out an underground alien base that had gone rogue, that the World Trade Center bombing and the Oklahoma City bombings were carried out using miniature nuclear devices, and that the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI or Star Wars, was actually intended as a defense against alien invasions. In response, in addition to all of this, Schneider would make all sorts of off-the-wall claims about what the government was developing with alien tech, including that the U.S. had an earthquake machine and that AIDS was created in a lab. He would explain some of this in one of his lectures. Quote, the federal government currently has an earthquake-causing device. I'm a geologist and I know what I'm talking about. During the earthquake in Kobe, Japan, there was no pulse wave, as is usually the case in normal earthquakes. She wasn't there. In 1989, there was an earthquake in San Francisco, and there was no pulse wave or anything like that either. This is a Tesla device that is being used for evil purposes. Shadow budget programs distort the essence of science as we know it. Look at AIDS. It was created by government order in a laboratory in Chicago, Illinois in 1972. It was a biological weapon that was used against the people of the United States. I know this because I have seen the documentation of the Office of Strategic Services, which, by the way, is still working to this day through the CDC in Atlanta. They use the glandular secretions of animals, humans, and humanoids to create a virus. These humanoids have friendly relations with the government. There's absolutely no defense against what they create. It is a biological weapon with potentially dire consequences. Every alien on our planet must be isolated. End quote. Schneider became very outspoken about these facts and the government's attempts to blind the public to the truth, publicly speaking at lectures and seminars in the USA, Canada, England, and Japan, often showing samples of some materials allegedly obtained using extraterrestrial technologies. Listening to how outlandish his claims are, it would be easy to write him off as a kook, but things took a sinister turn when he turned up dead under mysterious circumstances. On January 17, 1996, Phil Schneider was found dead at his home in Wilsonville, Oregon, with his neck wrapped with piano wire and his own catheter tubes, and there was signs of what looked like torture. At the time, there was the persistent idea among Schneider's believers that he had been killed for divulging too much top secret information, assassinated for knowing too much, or at least by someone who truly believed he did. The official stance was that it was a suicide, forgetting for a moment that torturing oneself and then strangling oneself with piano wire isn't a very traditional method of suicide. There are several other details that make it all the more ominous. Schneider had claimed that his life had been threatened on numerous occasions by the government and that 11 people he knew with similar information had been fatally silenced, often explained away on suicides. One of these was Ron Rummel, a former Air Force intelligence officer and publisher of the publication Alien Digest, who was found dead on August 6, 1993, of a gunshot wound to the head. Although it was also deemed a suicide, there had been no blood on the gun, no fingerprints on the barrel and handle of the weapon, and there had been a suicide note not written by a left-handed person when Rummel was right-handed. Interestingly, no autopsy had been performed, and Rummel's body was cremated less than 24 hours later. Does this have any connection to Schneider's strange death? Was he killed for something he divulged? Or was this just a delusional individual who killed himself in such a way as to make it look like that? Unfortunately, we may never know for sure. Moving into the 2000s, we have several more strange cases along these lines. In April of 2001, a prolific author of unexplained phenomena, Ron Bonds, mysteriously died of a common food poisoning bacterium that rarely leads to death, but for some reason turned deadly for him. More sinister still was the death of prominent UFO researcher Paul Vigay in 2009. In February of that year, the 44-year-old was found about bobbing, about in the churning sea off the coast of Portsmouth, Hants, leaving a series of strange cryptic passwords behind his phone that no one could figure out. Although authorities were quick to label it as a suicide, Vigay's friends and family are adamant that he was not suicidal, and the coroner was also not able to verify whether it was suicide or not, saying, "I cannot say beyond reasonable doubt that yes, Paul has taken his own life. The only person who could tell us what was going on in his mind and what happened that night is sadly not here to tell us." Perhaps one of the weirdest cases of all is also the most recent. Conspiracy theorist and UFO expert Max Spears was well known for delving into government cover-ups, and in July of 2016 he was in Warsaw, Poland, visiting a friend and also planning on attending a conference on conspiracy theories and UFOs. On July 16th, Spears' friend found him on the sofa, unresponsive and having vomited up a viscous black liquid. It would turn out that there were some pretty suspicious details surrounding the death, one being a text message he had written to his mother just before his death, which read, "Your boy's in trouble. If anything happens to me, investigate." Also odd is that there was never any actual official autopsy done on the body, and adding to this was that Spears was a healthy young man with no history of physical issues, making it odd that he would just drop dead on that sofa. There would also be very little word on the state of the investigation until 2019, when authorities would rule the death as being caused by drug use and pneumonia. Max's mother would say of it all, quote, "Max was a very fit man who was in good health, and yet he apparently just died, suddenly on a sofa. All I have is a death certificate from the Polish authorities that it was from natural causes, but no post-mortem was done, so how can they tell that? They are also refusing to release any paperwork about it to me because, absurdly, I don't have his written permission. Apparently, he had not suffered any obvious physical injuries, but he could have been slowly poisoned, which is why the results of toxicology tests from his post-mortem are so important. Again, we are left to wonder if this really was an accident, or did some nefarious agency deem him to be a threat and have him erased? It really is quite the conundrum. and the case seems to be in a limbo of strangeness and pure speculation. End quote. The main conspiracy idea behind all of these deaths is that these people were removed from the equation by nefarious parties, with government agencies and even the men in black coming into play. Skeptics would point out that people die, it is a fact of life, and that of course UFO researchers are going to fall victim to this as well. Yet, with the strange circumstances and details surrounding some of these cases, it makes one wonder what is really going on. Is this all just coincidence and reading things into it all? Or is there something more sinister going on? The question remains, and if you are one of those who delves into UFOs, it might be best to keep a set of eyes in the back of your head. You just never know. Here we have looked at a range of strange deaths linked to UFOs, covering human mutilations, bizarre suicide pacts, dark nefarious conspiracies, and beyond. Although we may never know the answers to the many questions they conjure up, they are an odd addition to the already odd landscape of the UFO phenomena. And yes, that's very strange indeed. And even through the years, you've always heard, I mean, everybody's heard about men in black, and some people say they're kind of alien like. Other people say basically they're government officials that come and tell people, witnesses, shut up, be quiet, that kind of deal. And then, you always have, there's always been those rumors around people dying, unusual, that just so happen to be, talking about things that, how can I say, that maybe at some point, maybe if they were left alone and they just went about their merry way and maybe just died natural, from what happens to anybody, they would stay in the realm of the kook. I'm not saying they are, but I'm saying at large. They will be looked at, oh, it's the kook. But once they die under these mysterious circumstances, and then you see, quick cremations, no postmortem, no this, no that, then of course, everybody, the conjecture is, okay, so there must have been some validity. Something's going on with what they were talking about or writing about, what they were investigating, because otherwise, what a weird thing to happen. So again, there you go. Very, very strange. Isn't it great? Very, very weird. I'll be back soon with you guys with, of course, some more eerie news. So stay put. I will be back very soon.